メリリー先生に、卒年教育卒業教育の変革と教員の昇進というものの関連性というふうなことについて、お話しいただきます。現在ですね、東大の方で、医学系のモデルコアカリキュラムの、文科省のですね、検討班というのをやっていたりというふうなこともあって、この話題は非常に重視しているところではあります。で、今おそらく日本の医学教育においてもその認証評価などにおいてですね、アウトカムというのが非常に重要なテーマになっているので、もう少し多くの方々に来ていただけるかなと思っていたのですが、非常に人数が少ないですけど、逆にいろいろとですね、もう少し身近にいろんなことを聞けるという良いチャンスになるだろうというふうに思っていますので、楽しみにしております。林先生、please.
Thank you for that welcome, Dr. Nishi, and I'm very glad to be back here in Tokyo. For today's talk, I'm talking about why education reform needs to be linked to faculty promotion and accreditation. It was a topic that was requested partly from my time previously here at the University of Tokyo as University of Tokyo went through its accreditation, and it was noted that most of the faculty are receiving promotions through their research work, but it was recognized that faculty really need to be recognized for their work in education as well. And so there were questions about why schools in the US actually have been changing their promotion systems to accept folks in the areas of education as part of their portfolios to be promoted. And I also wanted to link changes in promotion to curriculum reform and accreditation. So during this session, we will discuss faculty promotion as it has evolved to include many different kinds of scholarship, not just primary basic research. I'll also talk about CPAR. I'll explain what that is in a bit, and its importance to accreditation and residency applications. Since I know many Japanese schools like to send their graduates abroad to US and Canada, I think that it's critical to know about the changes that are happening in the US and Canadian systems, since you will be sending your graduates into those systems. And then I'll talk about the relationship of CPAR to educational reform, scholarship, and faculty promotion. So I think we all realize that academic medical centers everywhere really have a three-part tripartite mission to provide patient care, which is often called service, research, basic research I think that everybody recognizes, and also education and training of nursing students, pharmacy, medical students, dental students, etc., both at the medical school level as well as the residency training level. So there were significant pressures from the clinical enterprise that really pushed a new method of management at academic medical centers. And so this really started in the late 1980s. I don't know how many of you are familiar with mission-based management. Familiar with that term? That's something that really came about starting from the budget crises as the medical systems in the US started changing. So from the mid-1900s through the 1980s, hospitals had as much money as they needed. But suddenly, with the healthcare changes in the US system, suddenly money became very tight. And so that's when mission-based budgeting started appearing. And then you may have been familiar with relative value units, RVUs. This is something that was used at many academic medical centers to account for the time that faculty worked in different tasks during their daily work. And then more recently, there's been the development of what are called educational value units, EVUs, for education-related contributions of faculty with increased recognition of the value of faculty development and education research. So there has been an evolution of faculty promotions. There's an increased recognition of the importance of clinicians and educators. So it's not just basic science. These academic medical centers realize that in order to compete in a very difficult clinical climate, they needed clinicians, top clinicians, who would attract patients and take care of much higher patient volumes. And you know, I was quite impressed the times I've come here to Japan, knowing the very high patient volume that all of your clinicians see here. It's quite remarkable. You know, our faculty complain about seeing too many patients, but they're really only seeing a fraction of the number of patients that you're seeing here. So the academic medical centers started recognizing that they needed to pay attention to each of the three areas of the mission equally. So the clinical service, the research, and the education, they realized they needed to pay attention to all three parts. So in order to do that, they needed to recognize scholarship beyond basic research or scholarship of discovery. And so there was an increased focus on looking at the rigor, originality, and significance of scholarship regardless of area. So what are some of the other areas of scholarship? I have in the bibliography a paper by Fetter, and they list a number of other areas of scholarship. Theoretical and basic science experimental types of scholarship, I think those are familiar to you. Clinical investigation, I can tell you back in the early 90s, 1990s, when our university started accepting clinical investigation health services research as equivalent to basic research, there was a huge controversy. You know, our faculty, there were some faculty who were quite upset, feeling that we were lowering the standards by accepting clinical research as equivalent to basic science research. You know, now it's completely accepted, but I can tell you when we started looking at this back in the 1990s, it was a huge controversy. And I know that University of Tokyo is interested in translational research. You know, when I met with your dean a couple of years ago, he was talking about pushing translational type research. This is something that's quite big in the US through our National Institutes of Health. Again, that was not recognized. That kind of translational research that was being done by clinicians was not recognized back in the 1990s. So this has been quite an evolution. Educational activity, faculty development, public service, clinical practice improvement, integration or application of clinical work, these were all areas that were not previously recognized, but that are now recognized fully for faculty promotion. So I don't know if anyone has questions about any of these types of scholarship. we can, definitely have time for questions at the end as well. So why did the academic medical centers broaden the types of scholarship it would accept? Frankly, a big piece was they needed to retain the clinicians for the challenges, the clinical service challenges that were happening in the medical centers. And in order to retain those talented faculty, they needed to provide a means for them to get promoted. And if you think of a clinician who is spending half their time seeing patients, and they're supposed to be doing the same amount of research as a basic researcher who does not have to see patients, that is totally unrealistic. They have less than half the time, because even if they're designated as seeing patients half the time, patient follow-up, the patient paperwork, all of that will take more than half of their time. And so the time left over for them to actually do research is much less than someone who is totally devoting all their time to basic research. And so finally, the recognition of this allowed changes in our promotion system. And so the other piece is that recognition of the growing importance of quality improvement practices. So this came out of health services research, but quality improvement research now is huge. And this is something that's being conducted at every single major medical center, and is really critical to the smooth running and constant competition that academic medical centers are facing in their clinical work. And I can tell you in Boston, Tufts is one of many competing medical centers. And so they're constantly looking at how can we improve our care so that when we are being compared, not just locally, but nationally, we are able to continue to attract patients to our medical center, because the competition is quite fierce. So I just want to take a moment to talk about translational science, again, because I know it's of interest here at University of Tokyo. In 2012, there were 60 major universities that received an NIH Clinical Translational Science Award. That's what CTSA stands for. Tufts was one of those. And at the time, in 2012, only a third of those 60 institutions actually had already changed their promotion criteria to accept team science. Now, if you think about it, basic research has always rewarded individual achievement. And when you look at university promotion for tenure, it's all about individual achievement. But suddenly, in translational science, it's team science. It's about how faculty can work together on interdisciplinary teams. And so the criteria for evaluating team science work had to change. And so this has created quite a shift in promotion criteria, the work of the peer reviewers and collaborators who actually have to learn how to interpret team science in a different way than they evaluated individual science previously. So this is a major change that's happened. Now, this was a review done in 2012. I would guess at this point now, 4 years later, I would say at least half of those 60 institutions now have changed their promotion criteria. My bet is not all have. My guess is 50. We have not done a recent survey of the institutions, but seeing how interdisciplinary work, team science, translational science is now recognized as of critical importance to academic medical centers. Promotions committees are being pushed to really look at changing their criteria for evaluating faculty. Promotion in education also has changed. This is something that I think stemmed out of the 1980s when faculty development was just starting. And it really was not until, there has been work in teaching portfolios accepting educational work as being relevant for promotion. That really started probably in the little bit of work in the 80s, some seminal work in the 1990s, but it really has only been, I'd say, in the last decade, last 10 to 15 years where a lot of work suddenly exploded. And so, there's been this slow evolution of what we call clinician educator portfolios, where faculty who do a lot of education in academic medical centers and medical schools can document their activities in a way that can be evaluated by promotion committees. And they're looking for contributions, not just at the institution, but at the local, regional, and national levels. And that those different levels of contribution are required for typically moving from an assistant to an associate professor, and certainly national level activity needs to be in your portfolio to be promoted to a full professor. And I don't know how many of you have heard of the educator academies. These also grew out of this movement, again, really more common in the last 10 years. And these academies are school-based to foster teaching excellence, provide peer support for the clinician educators, and to promote innovation in curriculum development, assessment, etc. And I say inclusive versus exclusive because there are different models of these academies. Some medical schools have academies that really include any of the clinician educators who are working in the educational enterprise. And so, they really welcome, all of their teaching faculty. Other schools have their academies as being very exclusive, where they save the academy for only their top clinician educators who have received multiple teaching awards, etc. And so, though that model has a very small group of faculty as belonging to that academy within that medical school. So there are a couple different models, there's no right or wrong, something that grows out of the culture of each school. However, nationally, in the US is the AAMC Academies Collaborative, and these are organizations that welcome anyone who is running an academy at the medical school level. The National Academies Collaborative is where those folks come together to share ideas about how they can make their school-based academy more effective. And I know that many folks here like to go to AMY, which is an outstanding organization as well, and their equivalent is called the Academy of Medical Educators. So if you're not familiar with either of those yet, I'd highly recommend those in terms of looking at what resources both of those groups have for teaching you about the different flavors of clinician educator portfolios and promotion. There's so many resources out there now, since it's now been happening for decades. There's a lot of publication out there about how that's been achieved at major institutions. And so now I want to move to curriculum reform, CPAR, and its connection to faculty development. Have questions now? Okay, sure.
What does it mean by national contributions of critical educators? Does it mean to build the curriculum of certain course, or what does it mean?
Okay, for educational scholarship, what they're looking for is that if you have developed, say you have participated in developing a new curriculum here, they want to see that the impact of your work has some national significance. And so how they would judge that would be that, as with other types of discovery, that you would be documenting your work, say in a publication or a workshop or some abstract presentations, and disseminate that locally, regionally, and nationally. So it may be that you would write about the curriculum reform that you've done. You would have your work accepted to a national conference where you would be able to share that work and discuss it, with other educators. And so that would be evidence of your having some national dissemination of the work that you've been doing. And that national level dissemination is actually required at the promotion to professor level. Other questions?
Probably my understanding, the promotion criteria has been changed quite a lot in these 20 years.
Yes.
And not only the research, but also the education or critical work is also very important promotion criteria.
Yes.
And for the education, probably education covers all the educational issues in each medical school. But if each school is extending the promotion criteria for the education, probably each school doesn't have enough knowledge or the framework to evaluate such kind of work. That's why collaboration is needed for all the medical schools, and this academy is a kind of key to change the culture and the system.
Yes, yes, and because I can tell you, in the early years when things were just starting to change, everybody was struggling with what criteria to use. But now it's been around for a couple decades, so there's been a lot published, and I actually included in the references, I can't remember whether I put it here, but it's definitely in the thumb drive that I gave to Mira-san. There is evidence-based criteria that is being used at Johns Hopkins. And I included papers from Johns Hopkins, University of California, San Francisco, Harvard, Mayo Clinic. These are all heavy research-based institutions that change their criteria to accept education, clinical work, etc. And the Johns Hopkins one I felt was a really excellent paper where they're very specific in defining the criteria that they're using. And so there are many excellent publications out there. So I'd really encourage you to look at those and see what feels like they would work here.
So, like in Japan, we are changing a new accreditation system, and all the medical schools want to follow the new system. But still, probably only the educational staff in each medical school are struggling for that. But other members, like basic researchers or the clinicians, do not follow the culture of such kind of change. But in the United States, maybe all the medical schools are changing the system of the cultures and so on.
Yeah, it's been a slow process, and it didn't happen quickly. You know, it was difficult, and so I think that one key is identifying who are your core faculty. And so many of the clinicians, you know, their focus, you know, just as for the basic scientists, the majority of the basic scientists, you know, their focus is their basic research. For many of the clinicians, their focus is their clinical work. But there's a small subset of each of those groups who are heavily involved in training and education. And so that's where you start, because those particular faculty are doing an incredible amount of work that really has not been recognized. And so, you know, and if you look at the Johns Hopkins article, you know, I think it's very clear about how they defined the ability for a faculty member to document their work in a way that could be clearly evaluated, in a way that's evidence-based. It's not just, oh, well, you know, I think they're doing work, but something very specific. So, you know, I think the system that they developed is one of the clearer systems that I've seen. You know, I think it's very helpful to, you know, read through that and see what you think.
Other questions? So let's move on.
Okay. So let's move to curriculum reform, CPAR, and its connection to faculty promotion. So if we think about it, the goal of medical education is to produce the next generation of competent, caring, independent practitioners to serve the public. And even at University of Tokyo, I know that, you know, a key part of your mission is discovery, is the basic research. But, you know, I know from participating in your accreditation process that still the majority of your graduates still practice clinical medicine. And frankly, it's the same at Harvard, it's the same at Johns Hopkins, etc. You know, even though very research-heavy institutions are training MD, PhDs, training basic researchers, the majority of graduates still practice medicine. And so that's a key piece to keep in mind as we think about how curriculum needs to reform. So, you know, here's a question. When you, how many of you teach residents? So a couple of you directly teach residents. So is there a gap between what you expect the residents to be able to do and what they actually are able to do on day one? Yes or no? I mean, so when your new group of residents start on day one, you know, are they all equally prepared? No. I mean, I'd be surprised if you said yes, because I don't think there's any program in the country, you know, our country, your country, I think anywhere, you know, there's always a difference in preparation for all of the trainees entering residency day one. So, you know, I want you to think about how big that gap is. In general, you know, in the group of residents, You know, is it across the board? You know, there are gaps everywhere. Are there, you know, small gaps, big gaps? You know, I want you to think about where those gaps are, how big they are. And so, I don't know if you know Paul Batalden at Dartmouth. He's done a lot of work on healthcare systems, and there are a lot of permutations of this quote, but you know, I like it quite a bit because, you know, it says every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And so if you are noticing gaps in the graduates when they enter your residency, it means that the current educational system is responsible for those gaps. And so, you know, this is what the US had looked at in developing what are called core EPAs. The core EPAs, one of the major goals is to decrease those gaps. So it stands for Core Entrustable Professional Activities, or EPAs, for entering residency, as defined by the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education. So that's our major organization that's responsible for residency education. And these core EPAs are common across all specialties with additional EPAs by specialty. So, you know, just as a diagram, so if you think about the expectations for the medical school graduate, across the United States, you know, we have about 130 medical schools. You have over 80. And, you know, there is quite a bit of variation. And so the ACGME, what they're trying to do with the core EPAs for entering residency, these core EPAs are considered a subset of what the medical students need to learn during their 4 years. But they want all graduates in the US to be proven by different types of assessment to have attained all those core EPAs before they graduate, so that when they enter the residencies, all those core EPAs should be equivalent across the board, regardless of what school they've graduated from. And those core EPAs are a subset of EPAs for any practicing physician, and in turn, those EPAs for any practicing physician are a subset of the EPAs that are being developed for specialties. And so, you know, from here you can see that here's the medical school graduate. They're now going to enter residency. Now they enter into a specialty or their general practice. And so when I talk about EPAs, the main focus is we're talking about these, the core EPAs for entering residency, but there's work that's being done right now for EPAs for the resident when they are in their residency training. So, you know, and I don't want that to be confusing. So, core EPAs are what is being taught during medical school for graduation to prepare them to enter residency. Okay, so what's the importance of CPAR? So currently, I mean, this really only came about, you know, in the last several years. You know, they started working on it, you know, I'd say within the last 10 years. And a few years ago, the AAMC, our Association of American Medical Colleges, picked 10 schools from across the country to pilot the implementation of CPAR. And they took a cross sample of schools, big, small, public, private, you know, etc., different regions of the country, So 10 schools that they felt were representative of the variety of schools in the US. And so they're currently implementing CPAR at those 10 schools, and they're collecting tons of data. At the same time, other schools are implementing CPAR on their own because they know that it's becoming a requirement. It's not an accreditation full requirement yet, but that's the direction it's going. So rather than waiting for this implementation pilot to be completed, schools are already jumping in. The CPAR guidelines are already published, and I've also included those reports in the bibliography, so those are available for you if you like. I think they're very well written. And so what implication does this have for international graduates? Well, if you think about it, if all US schools are going to be following these core EPAs, and all US graduates will be trained to be competent in all those core EPAs, if your graduates are not familiar with that and have not been trained to be competent in all of those areas, when they go to a US program for residency training, they're going to be at a disadvantage. So I think it's going to be really critical that really think about and look at what these EPAs are. They're pretty basic. If you look at them, it's not difficult. And I think if you look at the list, you will agree that these are things medical graduates should be able to do. So, I don't think it's going to be as hard as it sounds. And the ECFMG certification that requires medical schools to have accreditation by 2023 in order for your graduates to enter a US or Canadian residency, even though CPAR is not yet part of that certification, it's coming. So, I think it's really important to know about this, know about the evolution, think about what implications that has as you're considering institution-based curriculum reform as well as national curriculum reform. So in the next couple of pages, I just gave you definitions. I'm not going to go over this, it's really just for your reference. So I defined an EPA. It's basically when you are able to trust a learner to perform a particular skill on their own. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. And I also define competency, domain of competence, milestones. These are terms that you're going to see a lot in this literature. So here are basic definitions and purely for your reference. So this is another diagram that came out of the curriculum guide. And it looks a little complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. And the reason I wanted to use this diagram is I know you've heard a lot about competency-based education. And specific competencies, they're very discrete, very clearly defined. And all these C's here stand for competencies, individual competencies that are in a particular domain. So this is a domain of a competency. So say this domain is for knowledge, there might be 2 competencies in knowledge that a medical student needs to know. This domain of competency may be skills, actual procedural skills. This domain might be professional attitudes. And so this is just diagramming, which competencies are required in each of these domains to actually be able to perform this EPA. And what this diagram illustrates is that an EPA requires multiple competencies in this activity. That's the big difference. You say, what's the difference between EPA and a competency? So an EPA is much broader, requiring multiple competencies to actually perform this activity. And this yellow and blue area here, all it's doing is defining a medical student who cannot yet be trusted, they're using the word pre-entrusted, but it's basically someone who is still a novice, someone who is still in the process of learning. They cannot yet be trusted to perform the activity on their own, as opposed to what a medical student looks like who can be trusted. And so in the workbooks that I reference, they actually give examples of what a student who is in this stage would look like, versus, in this particular EPA, in this particular activity, what they would look like versus what a student who actually could be trusted to perform that activity, what they would look like. And so they have great examples in there, and I'm not going to go into all that detail, but I think this diagram is really critical to show you the difference between the two. And then I pulled out a table. I don't know if you can read it on your handout, probably prints pretty small, but this is on page 9 of the curriculum guide, and it specifically compares and contrasts EPAs versus competencies. So again, this table is really helpful as you're trying to understand the terminology and understand the approach and the difference between a purely competency-based curriculum versus one that focuses on EPAs. And I have to say, when they first came out with EPAs, a lot of faculty rolled their eyes. Said, oh my gosh, we barely even learned competency-based education, and now you're throwing another thing at us. But actually, if you read through the work on the EPAs, it makes a lot of sense. Because the EPAs, I think, much more closely mimic the actual skills that students and residents need to do when they're actually seeing patients. Competencies are good, and learning and assessing specific competencies is part of the work of the EPAs, but it's not enough. The specific competencies are so discrete, they really are not integrative. They don't combine all the different competencies to actually perform an activity that can really mimic actual patient care. And so one example, and this again is just taken out of the curriculum guide, this one is the graduating student must be able to recommend and interpret common diagnostic and screening tests. And then they go on to describe what that actually means. And then later in the workbook, they provide very specific examples of the competencies, the domains of competencies that are required for this, etc. So the workbook is very well organized and I think quite clear. So what's the value of EPAs? Why do we need to bother? The major impetus behind developing EPAs is actually increased patient safety. If you think about it, I think here in Japan, my understanding is that your students and your residents do much less direct patient care our students at the equivalent level. Our students start quite early, actually at Tufts, we have our students seeing patients from the very first year. I mean, they're only doing histories, and they may do basic physicals, etc. But by the time they are in their clerkship year in year 3, they're participating fully in the clinical care team. And so having EPAs where we're very clear about the skills that they must have at every level, I think very much is a positive for increased patient safety. The other thing is that you, as a residency program, will need to provide less remediation at orientation. Are you familiar with the team boot camp? We use that for describing an intense orientation, typically a week-long session where you try to help all the new residents catch up, with the skills, because they're coming in from different schools, their skills are uneven. The boot camp is a way of remediating that. But if we do a good job with the EPAs at every school, there should be much less need for these boot camps. The other thing is that a resident can now be much more confident to participate in care from day one. New residents are always very nervous, but if they have completed and passed all of their core EPAs, they can be more confident from day one, and also much more active in tracking competencies. If you look at the workbook, you'll see that the students can follow along. They will know up front, what EPAs they're going to be tested on, and we can create many different paths for them to learn each EPA, and so the students can be much more proactive in tracking their own progress for these competencies and EPAs each year. Then when you get into residency EPAs, this is, on that original diagram where I showed, the core EPAs for graduating students, but then later on, there are EPAs being developed for residency. That is actually happening right now. And so different disciplines, surgery, medicine, etc., are all developing their EPAs within the residency. And the goal of that is that the residents will be certified more consistently to be able to practice independently once they enter practice after their residency is completed. And for you here in Japan, if you are pushing your curriculum to embrace EPA type curricula, then your residents will be more comparable to other medical school graduates. So for those of you who are interested in identifying EPAs to implement here, one of the other references I included is Chen et al., Developing Entrustable Professional Activities for Entering Clerkships. This was from Academic Medicine, and there's their whole cascade of a process to use. And again, there's much that's been published. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can look at publications out there for ideas and approaches and how to begin this process. So, I just have a diagram here of how you might map student EPAs across the various years, linking them first to basic milestones and competencies in pre-clerkship, all the way to graduation. And then there's an equivalent mapping for residents, again, basic milestones and competencies for residents entering the program, and then mapping them through the programs and back to published EPAs in US, Canada, and other countries where you send your residents. So why bother mapping? Why did I include this? Mapping is really important when you're developing curricula. So when you're actually designing your curriculum, you want to know where EPAs fit into your larger curriculum. And it helps not just in the curriculum design, but also how to assess these new changes. And the mapping will help you provide evidence of comparability and quality, and that evidence is what will greatly assist in the accreditation of your program that's necessary for your graduates to obtain the ECFMG certification when they're applying for US, Canadian, and other residencies. So, there's this cycle of teaching, assessment, and in this case, assessing EPAs, then revising your teaching methods, and then assessing again, teaching with that revised curriculum, assessing yet again, and just going around and around in that circle. And it's critical to be collecting and using data to improve teaching. And here I'm talking about program data versus national data. So you have started an accreditation process here in Japan. There was a lot of work that went into accreditation here. I know a very intensive year of data gathering. That data is not just for that year prior to accreditation. The intent is that the data needs to be collected annually so that you have longitudinal data and you can show progress and change over time, not just right before accreditation happens. And so for our accreditation of our medical schools, we have to show them that longitudinal data. The amount of data we have to provide is just astronomical, but it is considered, they want to see the CQI, the continuous quality improvement, just as an ongoing process. And we're constantly being compared across programs with a national view. When we send in data to the AAMC, we get back our school data in comparison to the aggregate of all other schools in the country. And that leads to both institutional and national decision-making and policy changes, and helps guide your institution and country where to invest your education dollars. You want to know what interventions are most effective, and be able to make those changes in response to effectiveness. And Dr. Onishi had mentioned outcomes. Educational outcomes are difficult. Patient outcomes are even more difficult. But this is something we're being pushed to look at. Whether or not our improvements in education and training really result in better patient outcomes and better patient safety. So back to promotion. Changing your training program to include competencies and EPAs with all the major changes in assessment and data collection and analysis, all of this is very hard work. It's a lot of work, and it's tough. This work needs to be the major focus of a core of faculty. One person alone cannot do this. It really has to be a well thought out team of faculty with support, real support from the school. And that work already is being recognized by associations and accreditation, but it must be recognized through institutional promotion as well. And you know, something that has taken a while to happen in the U.S. It now has. It's always a work in progress. You know, people are always trying to refine it, but it's something that really has to happen. So during the session, we discussed faculty promotion as it has evolved to include many types of scholarship. We talked about CPAR and its importance to accreditation and residency, and also the relationship of CPAR to educational reform, scholarship, and promotion. And I'll end with, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. And with that, thank you for your kind attention and welcome any further questions.